Now, what if I told you the main reason you're not improving as quickly as you want to is because you're overcomplicating what it actually takes to go fast? Now, trust me, when I first started, I was in your position as well. You've watched hundreds of videos online or on YouTube about how to improve your technique, and now you just have an absolute overload of information. You're not sure exactly where to start, and you don't know the biggest reasons why you're off pace from your favorite drivers. Now, if that sounds familiar and if it's something you are struggling with, I recommend watching right to the end of this video, because today we're going to be talking about how to structure your corner effectively and in a more simple way. So stick around to the end to see a live example of this being used so you can apply it to your own driving. Now, before we get too far in this video, we need to go over the most important rule for these exercises coming up, and really something that's going to simplify this process for the rest of your racing career. The rule is, in 99.999% of single apex corners, you need to be only beginning to roll on the throttle at the apex. So when I say at the apex, I don't necessarily mean the perfect geometrical, halfway point of a apex curb on track. We'll learn where to place our apex shortly, but for simplicity's sake, we're going to say the point in the corner at which you're at the most inner portion. And again, we're only rolling on the throttle when we get to our selected apex point. All right, let's move on to step one about how to structure our corner more effectively. Now, a lot of times when I talk to students about how they can go and gain some time by restructuring their corner, they typically think it all starts with the beginning of the corner, but the easiest way to tell if you're not structuring your corner correctly is actually to look at corner exit. And the reason why we want to look at corner exit first is because that's essentially the sum of the whole equation there. So if your corner exit is not super optimal at the limit, you'll know you're doing something wrong, either mid-corner, on entry, or whatever the case might be. So what we're going to do here is we want to drive around on track with the car track combo, we're familiar with, whatever we're practicing for that week. And I want you guys to be very specific and very strict about identifying which corners on track where your exit is either under the limit or over the limit. So when I say your exit is under the limit, what we're looking for is cases where you only needed to track out, half track distance, 2/3 of track distance, or if we want to be really precise, where you had an extra foot of room to use on exit. Now, on the other hand, when we're over the limit, this can come in many different levels of severity. So for example, a very minor example of over the limit on exit will be having to lift off of the throttle or hesitate off of the throttle after the apex. It might be, a really slow throttle application as you're managing understeer on exit. The really big example would be going off track on exit, into the grass, into the gravel. Now you might be asking yourself, well, what am I going to do with this information, knowing where I'm under the limit and over the limit on exit? It actually all has to do with your apex selection. So let's say, for example, you are under the limit on most corner exits. Well, that's actually going to tell you a lot about your apex, because in that case, your apex is probably going to be too late in the corner. When you have an apex that's too late, it probably means you're going to be too far pointed to the inside on corner exit. And obviously it'll be vice versa for going over the limit on exit. You are probably apexing a little bit too early, and it is shooting you too far outwards as you get past the apex, and then of course over the limit on exit. Once you start adjusting your apex and throttle points and get your exits up to the limit, we can now move on to our corner entry to ensure that part is up to the limit as well. So let's say, for example, you originally started with an exit that was under the limit, meaning your apex was too far forward, it was too late in the corner. You've now moved your apex earlier, but what that means is you're now going to have to brake a little bit earlier for the corner. You're going to have to pick an earlier reference in order to account for the earlier apex, because now you're going to be rolling on the throttle sooner. On the other hand, it's pretty much the opposite. Let's say you're going over the limit on exit at the starts. You're now going to have to push your apex and throttle point a little bit later in the corner, and because you're doing that, because you're going to be rolling on the throttle later now, you can push your braking point / reference a little bit further down the track. So I hope that makes sense for you guys. That's it for the explanation part. We're going to jump on the sim behind me now and show you in real time what this exercise looks like. All right, so for this example, we're just going to go through one corner to make it as simple as possible to start. Here we have the Formula 3 at Montreal. I've picked the hairpin because it's really obvious to assess the different parts of the corners compared to corners that might be, closer to 90 degrees or just hard harder to tell in general. Keep in mind, this does apply to all single apex corners, but again, this example does make it a little bit more obvious. What we're going to do first is we're going to run through the corner. Again, like I said in step 1, we're first going to analyze our exit, and we'll see what we have to adjust there to ensure our exit is no longer on one extreme of that spectrum. All right, so obviously I exaggerated that just a little bit, but overall what we analyzed on exit there was that I was over the limit. In that case, I hit the wall. Most people probably would have hesitated off of the throttle or applied the throttle really slowly in order not to do that. But at the end of the day, you're still over the limit on corner exit. So if we remember from the explanation part, if our exit is consistently over the limit, that probably means our apex is a little bit too early, assuming we're rolling on throttle at the apex. If our apex is too early, it's going to send us too far out on corner exit, and we're going to go over the limit and hit the wall like we just did. So now what I'm going to start to do is make my apex a little bit further into the corner using references, and we're going to see how that adjusts my corner exit. So we saw there, I definitely apexed quite a bit later than the first time, but our exit was still a little bit over the limit. While we didn't hit the wall, I still had to have some hesitations in my throttle input in order to not do so. So we're going to make our apex even later this time, and we'll see what that changes on corner exit. All right, while that wasn't 100% perfect, you guys can kind of see what we're working at here. So we continue to move our apex further and further until our exit was at the limit without having to make any sacrifices. Now, the one thing I didn't change was my entry. So every single time there, I pretty much broke exactly at the 2. And while it was kind of perfect when we were taking an earlier apex, now that we're turning in later, apexing later, rolling on the throttle later, it does mean if I continue to brake at the 2 board, I am going to be driving quite a bit under the limit of the tire. So what we're going to do now is start to brake a little bit later so we can take full advantage of the grip the tires are giving us without making any compromises now that we've restructured our corner. So ideally, what this is also going to allow you guys to do is be more precise with your references, which is of course really, really important. At the apex, you're going to need to find more accurate places to place your car in order to plan for the corner, in order to know when to roll on the throttle. That's going to help you adjust that if it's needed as well. And then same thing for corner entry. You guys are going to need to be really precise with your braking reference, because if you're not, it is going to throw off the whole plan for the corner, especially if you're driving to the limit. You can't afford to make a mistake with when you're engaging your inputs as a driver. That's pretty much it for this video. I hope you guys learned something today. If you want more free coaching, please consider subscribing to the channel and it'll motivate me to make more videos. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you in the next one.